Apparently there's a footballer called Noel Whelan as well, and as you can see from the physique, I'm certainly not a footballer. Speaking of the internet, myself and David Farrell, in addition to the debate we've been having here today, have been having a competition on Twitter, tweeting from the McGill Summer School. And for your information, the tweet attracting most attention is John Fitzgerald's suggestion that there should be a Prada handbag shopping scrappage scheme. It's creating an awful lot of debate on Twitter and on the internet. The lawyer in me says that seeing as the purchasers would be predominantly female and males of a certain orientation, it would probably fall foul of the Constitution, but it might be interesting nonetheless. I have to start today because I'm going to talk a bit about transparency among other things. I have to start with an admission of interest or a declaration of interest. In fact, in the current environment, it's more like a confession. So, Father McVerry, wherever you are, bless me, for I have sinned. I have been a member of Fianna Fáil. I've worked for the party for 5 years in the late 80s and early 90s. Fright of fright, I've even been a candidate for the party in 1997. I make that admission now for 3 reasons. Firstly, I want to counter the little dig given at us all by Gareth Fitzgerald last night, which suggested we're all political theorists, those who oppose these notions for electoral reform, and say that I have that practical dimension to some of what I bring here today. Secondly, because I'm going to do you the compliment of being frank and blunt and criticise, I think across the board, some of those who are currently playing in our political system and playing in the political reform debate, because I think the political parties are about to pull a fast one in the political reform debate. Inevitably, the response will be, well, sure, he would say that because he comes from a Fianna Fáil jail pool, whatever. I'll let you decide whether I am overcompensating or biased as a result of that background. And the third reason I'm making that declaration is because I want to tell a couple of stories from my time in politics to illustrate the first of my point. The last substantial project I did for Fianna Fáil was in the autumn of 1997, with Mary McAleese's first or only presidential election campaign, and Noel Dempsey was the director of elections. And for the campaign, we set up a new campaign headquarters, and we brought in about 10 college students, postgraduate level, who were involved in the party to come and do work in party headquarters. My function was a relatively mundane one. It was to plan in advance where the presidential campaign tour would go tomorrow or the day after, and negotiate with the party organisation and media and whatever what Mary McAleese would be on tour several days later. You'll remember that was quite an extraordinary campaign. There was a surprise selection of Mary McAleese over Albert Reynolds by Fianna Fáil. There was the implosion in large part of the Eddie Roche campaign. There was the leak of the Department of Foreign Affairs memo, which Owen Harris and others said suggested Mary McAleese was an unreconstructed Catholic nationalist. There was the row between Mary McAleese and Nell McCafferty over whether or not she would have the poppy. It all culminated, you may recall, on a Sunday night news story that there had been a tussle in the lobby between a relatively short minister and Jim Fahey, the RT Western correspondent, between Noel Dempsey and Jim Fahey. The rumours, at least that made their way back to headquarters, is that the minister got the upper hand. But I remember that night the postgrads who were working in the party headquarters, the young people coming in saying, "My God, this must be the most amazing presidential election campaign ever." And I said, "You should have been here 7 years ago for Lenihan v. Robinson." Everyone thinks they live in the most interesting times. People forget a lot of these things have happened before. Everybody, our attention span and our sense corporate memory when it comes to political and other development is extraordinarily short, and it's even shorter still for the younger generations. I first got involved in politics as a young teenager. In the early 80s, you had within 18 months 3 general elections and 3.5, 4 heaves against Charlie Haughey within Fianna Fáil. I used to say to my dad, "My God, this must be the most amazing political times ever." He says, "You should have been around for the arms trial." This country and the constitutional system it had designed ultimately in the 1980s managed ultimately to integrate both sides of the Civil War, to survive as an independent state, a unique enough entity for 20th century born states, to survive as an independent state, to chart a course through the Second World War, to deal with the reality of troubles not on its border, and in a sense at times scaringly looking like they might overspill into this part of the country. So in some ways we have to start by saying it's a compliment to our constitutional system that we have got to this particular point we're in, and give ourselves as a constitutional entity some credit for the point we have got to, and some recognitions that this crisis too will pass. And it will pass perhaps with constitutional change, perhaps ultimately with constitutional change. It is, as David Farrell says, a relatively unique moment in our political system, and there is, thankfully in my view, a lot of pressure for political reform. My concern is that, like David, my concern is that that moment will be wasted, and I want to address some of those things in a second. I first want to pay compliment to Joe Mulholland for two things. Firstly, again, he's picked the right team at the right time. There's been an awful lot of discussion about renewing the Republic, changing our constitution, reform our political system over the course of the last year. Much of it, I have to say, has been very vague, at times superficial and populist. I hope that through the course of this week you will get the full spectrum of views, a cross-section and informed context about the various proposals around the need for political reform and what should change within our political system. He has also, in a sense, shown a more sophisticated understanding of the issue in the title he has given this session, which is, by putting our electoral system and our political culture together, do they need change? He has shown that he appreciates, and what a lot of those in the debate don't appreciate is, this is not just a question of systems design. It's a question of the political environment within which that system operates and within which our politics operate. And that I endorse some of what David says in terms of changing the system, redesigning the system. Won't solve the problems it has to live with because it's dealing within a certain political culture. Part of the simplistic notions that have been advanced, among the simplistic notions that have been advanced in my view in recent months, is this notion that if we only had more qualified politicians or more commerce degrees or more science degrees or more entrepreneurs, we'd have had different and better policy and political operation in the last number of years. I don't accept that is the case. I don't believe that a cabinet made up of specialists or overwhelmingly dominated by one particular type of specialist, or a cabinet table laden with science or commerce PhDs, would have necessarily dealt with this issue. That doesn't give sufficient regard to their complex set of skills which you need to have in the Irish political system, operating within Irish political culture in order to be an effective politician. Some of our best politicians have been highly qualified people. Some of our best politicians have been highly qualified people. The revolutionary generation, by its very nature, had little in terms of formal education. But even some of those most successful in recent times have been the politicians who didn't have much beyond primary or secondary education. I instance Ray McSharry as an example. He did have entrepreneur experience. It was mixed entrepreneur experience. Some of his businesses experience didn't work out. He had only a primary school education. He is generally regarded as one of the most successful ministers for finances we've had in a long time. Albert Reynolds brought enterprise experience to the Taoiseach's office, and you can certainly look, talking about the set of skills, it illustrates the point. You can certainly question his party leadership skills. You can certainly question his coalition management skills, but you can't question his ability to make very good, important, quality decisions, particularly when it came to the peace process. And it's worth remembering that our political system has delivered some extraordinary successes in the last couple of decades, on a cross-party basis, and indeed our public service has delivered some extraordinary successes. The peace process, its contribution, the southern contribution, if you like, to the peace process, have been one aspect of it. I suppose I'm arguing that the baby not go out with the bathwater. I'm arguing that in the trauma of the current economic crisis, we do not begin to exhibit the behaviour of compulsive obsessives and begin to change, alter and mess around with our constitutional system just for the sake of it. Yes, if there are good and workable specific solutions that need to be changed to the Constitution, let them come forward, but there are other things we can do in the meantime. I don't intend to dwell extensively on the proposals for electoral reform, because as I expected, David Farrell has dealt with them fairly extensively, and he's more competent and qualified to deal with them than I am. But there are three aspects of our political system and our political culture which I do want to say something about and focus on. The first of these is the culture of obsessive secrecy which permeates our politics and public sector. The second is the stranglehold which our executive branch has over our Parliament. And the third is the short-term focus of our politicians and of much of our political debate. I want first, however, for a moment to say something about my concern that the current opportunity for political reform will be wasted. All the signs are that the political parties will manage their way through the current pressure for real political reform, on the government side by sitting mute, and on the opposition side by kicking the hot potatoes within political reform off into the long grass of constitutional conventions or citizens' assemblies. I'm going to take the opposition first, so you can rest for a minute, Minister. The opposition parties have all been prominent in talking the talk and speaking much about the need for wholesale constitutional reform, and sounding radical by talking about constitutional assemblies or constitutional conventions. Apart from relatively superficial proposals on relatively minor aspects of our political systems, like, for example, the length of the President's term or the titles of Dáil's committees, the opposition parties have avoided addressing the detail of political reform, of what they would do, in particular in terms of constitutional reform. Suggesting that some constitutional review group or all-party committee should examine the matter has been the device repeatedly deployed by political parties of all descriptions to put on the long finger political reform. Instead of making big decisions, politicians always want to set up big committees. The best way to sound radical but avoid doing anything is to talk about root and branch reconfiguration of our constitutional system. In its document, New Politics, Fine Gael promises within 12 months of office. Originally, in the first draft of the document, they promised to do 5 things. Abolish the Seanad, put 4 standing Dáil committees, give them constitutional status, enable a petition system for electors to the Dáil, and shorten, as I said, the presidential term from 5 to 7 years. The Seanad, abolishing the Seanad is superficially attractive and a populist notion because the Seanad has proved largely ineffective. I'm among those who have said, before you make the final decision to abolish it, why don't you make one decent attempt to reform it rather than the 15 committees that you set up to talk about reforming it? And my view is that, again, reforming the Seanad is something that could be tried in the coming months by legislation, not by constitutional change. You could actually extend the vote in the Seanad to every trade union member, every professional body member, every teacher, rather than do it the way that it's currently done by county councils. And you could do that by legislation. And I don't see why the government just doesn't propose that widening of the electorate as a trial for the next Seanad election. Fine Gael can hardly oppose it because their attitude is it shouldn't exist in any case. Then one of the Fine Gael's proposals, the most significant of them perhaps in the document, was that 15 TDs would be elected by a national list system. And that proposal didn't survive into the final published document. Harry McGee in the Times, I think about 4 or 5 weeks before the Fine Gael document was published, reported that the draft contained this proposal that 15 TDs would be elected by a national list system. I have some reservations about it that turn on this electorate question that David talked about. It was the most significant proposal in the document. It disappeared from the document. Why? Largely it appears because it got opposition within the Fine Gael Parliamentary Party. What did they do? They said, oh, well, we have a citizens' assembly look at that. Rather than make the decision, they parked it off to the citizens' assembly. And somebody should ask Phil Hogan tonight, from the audience or perhaps the chair, should ask Phil Hogan tonight, why, if that is such an important proposal that it could only be dealt with by citizens' assembly, have you touted the fact that Enda Kenny has announced the abolition of the Senate as a leadership initiative coming from him? It's one of the points I'm making is all of the parties are about to pull a fast one. They're going to talk their way, chart their way carefully through the current pressure for political reform and leave the really difficult stuff, if that's what matters, to be dealt with over the course of a year or two when the heat's wound down from it, when there's again another election to touch on, to deal with the real issues. Labour are the same. In March, Eamon Gilmore announced that he was in favour of a constitutional convention to deal with political reform generally. And on a radio discussion that myself and David Farrell had with Senator Alex White, the party's leader in the Senate, he dismissed the suggestion I was making, which I'm making now, that that was equivalent to parking the tough decisions off into the sky without Labour having to say what its own views were on constitutional change. He resisted that notion by saying, don't worry, Noel, he says, we will publish detailed proposals and we will do it soon. That was in March. This is now July. Maybe that Pat Rabbitte and Eamon Gilmore speaking here this week will get all the detail we desire before the week is out. I wouldn't hold my breath for it, but I'd be interested to see it. If the contributions from the opposition side have been largely about political positioning and public relations, what is frightening and striking about the government side is how silent they've been on political reform over the last 2 years. Notwithstanding the fact that our entire political system and policy process has been shaken by the tremors of the recent economic earthquake, this government has had very, very little to say about the political reform agenda. I have tried across the web with the benefit of Google and otherwise, for anything that Taoiseach himself or his senior ministers have said about political reform since he came to power, which coincides in some ways with within a couple of months, the collapse and this economic crisis. Even if these were ordinary times, this government could be regarded as a relatively conservative on the issue of political reform by comparison to its predecessors. Even if it manages to survive to get its programme for government passed, all it will have achieved in this area, if it manages to achieve it all, will be a Dublin mayor, which is a relatively minor change in local, not national government, an electoral commission, which again I can't understand why it's taken 4 years to do that when all the parties agreed on it in their manifestos before the last election. But even if it achieves an electoral commission, that's a largely administrative change. A whistleblower's charter, which again is something all of the parties have agreed on 10 years ago in most instances, and perhaps also a ban on corporate donations, if they can establish as a matter of law that's constitutionally permissible. But in any case, even if they do, in my view, that can easily be circumvented by wealthy people making private donations, which will be secret up to a certain amount. It's disturbing that in light of the shockwaves which have shaken our politics in the last 2 years, there has been no new impetus or no new ideas on political reform from the government parties. No acceptance even that our system needs to change in light of the lessons to be learnt from the current banking, fiscal and jobs crisis. That may be about the change. Again, no fewer than 5 ministers are scheduled to speak at Glenties over the course of the week. And I will be hoping, beginning perhaps with what we're about to hear shortly, that ministers, qua ministers, because they are ministers. If one of the complaints in our system is that it's over-centralised, they sit on the most powerful committee in our system. That as a cabinet, that as a ministers and as government, they tell us what their proposals are to implement for radical political reform. I passionately believe that our political system needs radical overhaul. I believe that this can be done, however, quicker and perhaps more effectively by procedural and legislative rather than constitutional change. It is precisely because I am of the view that our political system needs to be transformed that I am pleading for those who campaign for political reform to focus on what can be achieved and achieved now. It would be a shame if this moment of political and economic crisis was to be wasted on merely setting up grand constitutional debating chambers. There are dozens of steps which our politicians could take as soon as the Dáil gets back from its summer recess, which cumulatively could transform our political system. I have written about many of them before, but I want to focus briefly on 2 of them. The first of those is a point I've dealt with in some detail in a couple of columns, and I've repeated some of the contents of those columns in the paper that will be published ultimately in Joe's book. But essentially what I'm arguing for is the concept of e-transparency. And that is that every single document that is currently answerable to freedom of information should just be published. It shouldn't require a retrospective query from a journalist for civil servants to go and dig the document out, and then there's a great gotcha headline in the newspapers. The day-to-day ordinary summary data, personal data of course would continue to be protected, but the day-to-day summary data, so large volumes of which is generated within the public sector and with public, should just be published as it's filed. Should just be published as it's filed. That would transform the way in which our politics and public sector operates. Every hour they spend, every penny they spend would be available to access online. And of course, there will be cynics or people who oppose a certain policy who will try to portray the information a certain way. But similarly, there will be an awful lot of information available to those who want to defend why certain things are being done, why certain money is being spent, and why a policy is one way or the other. I instance in those couple of columns the example of the the issue that came to light when John O'Donoghue's expenses controversy broke about officials on a Sunday evening. I knew this from friends of mine who worked in foreign affairs. On a Sunday evening, a car would call to the third secretary's flat in London or wherever and bring them to the airport, where their job was, in the absence of the ambassador, to greet the minister, welcome him to the UK and take him over to Terminal 4 and put him on the plane to America or wherever he or she was going. If we had known online how much that was costing us, it would have been stopped long ago. Or if those commissioning that expenditure knew that it was going to be published online, they'd have stopped it long ago. As soon as it became public, you saw the recent reports in the papers, as soon as it became public, the embassy in London completely changed what they were doing. They bought a people carrier. They stopped going when the minister was only going from one place to the other. And they reduced the budget for that type of expenditure by, I think, about 87% was the figure quoted in the paper, in the year that followed all this coming into the public domain. If we'd known what Foss was spending its advertising budget on, it just wouldn't have happened. There would literally have been thousands of people sitting at their screens at home doing open source accountability and transparency on our public sector and on our politics and on everything generally. There's a classic case where that can apply to politics directly. I share the same concern that Dr. Fitzgerald identified last night about the role that private money has played in our politics and in our political campaigning. And I'd be particularly conscious, as he may be, but that even since his time in politics, that has been transformed. The extent to which parties now pay for posters to go up, for leaflets to go through doors, and even for people in some cases to go knocking doors, is extraordinary. That has created a need for money, that has created a reliance on private money, and that has completely distorted the political parties internally and the electoral process generally. The solution is, in part, in banning corporate donations, but actually the answer is publish every donation. Above 50 or 100 euros maybe, so you don't have to put everybody who buys a ticket or put some money into the national collection on the way. But apart from that, why shouldn't every party just publish every single donation it gets above 100 euros, and allowing for market competition sensitivities in the political field, and generally publish what it then goes and spends the money on. And then we'll be able to see where money, and there's nothing actually wrong with somebody wealthy if they want to, making a donation to a political party. There's probably wise to have a limit on it, as we have, but as Des O'Malley and others have argued, if you don't allow people to give donations, private donations to parties, then you lock out new parties or new candidates from the system. Oh, fine, let it continue to happen. Just put it all up there on the web and let people debate about the rights or wrongs or the reasons why a person has or has not donated to political parties. I'm going to turn, at the Chairman points at the watch, to the last point, last 2 points. And the first is the need for a radical change in the relationship between our executive, our cabinet and our parliament. And all of those changes could be done in October. All of the politicians keep telling us they're all in favour of transforming the business in Leinster House, the committee system, the question system, the way parliamentary business. They all tell us they are. Why not just do it? None of it would require constitutional change. Introduce a system where the chairs of committees are allocated under the D'Hondt system, where the elections of committee chairs is done by secret ballot rather than nominated by party leaders, where the business of the House is controlled by a party business committee which is dominated by backbenchers. The other practical suggestion I had in the area of clientelism, if you want to call it that, or where TDs spend most of their time a lot of their time making local representation, I have to say I see a value in it. I grew up in a household where my dad was the county councillor, and I see an extraordinary value in having somebody, particularly in the local system, who people can come to. All of the websites in the world, and I endorse the suggestions David has made, but all of the websites in the world won't necessarily reach out to everybody. There will always be people who will want to go to somebody they know to deal with these type of issues. But there are a range of things. We could just make it illegal for TDs to make representations about. Just make it illegal for them to write to the Health Board for preference and health treatment. We've done it already with the DPP. It's the famous provision that Trevor Sargent fell foul of. And we've done it in terms now of NAMA. Just make it illegal. And then the TD can say to the constituents, I'll give you all the information you want. I'll print it off the website. I'll give you all the help you want. But I can't actually do anything to change your entitlement to it. They can't anyway, but they create the impression that they can. My final point is about the focus of our politics and how it's now so short-term. It was once a criticism of our politicians that all they focused on was the next election. I wish it was even that long. The majority of them are now purely focused on next weekend's newspaper headlines or tonight's 6-1 news stories. It is extraordinary the extent to which our politics at all levels is now focused on, is now in a sense synced with media deadlines and timescales rather than with the issues. And it means that because there's been so many more media now, I tell the story of when Jack Lynch used to tour the country in 1977 in his presidential election. He'd sit down every night at the end of the day, perhaps about 8, half 8, with 5 journalists who were covering his presidential election campaign, probably over hours. They'd talk about the events of the day or the political issues of the day. Now, the last time the parliamentary parties went on tour last autumn, each of them had something like 150, 160 people accredited to cover them. It is simply a bigger part of politics, the media relationship, than the media management, or try to manage it in terms of the relationship. And the politicians are now entirely focused on that, rather than finding the space to reflect on the issues, making the decisions to be strategic about the issues, taking a view on what is in the long-term interest of the country, rather than what will look well, read well, or sound right when the matter comes to be covered in the media. My final and most significant point is this, is that this is a unique moment, and it is important to leverage all that pressure, demand and interest in political reform on immediate legislative and regulatory changes. Thank you.